By early 1943, the Japanese Empire was at its height. The country had occupied Malaya and Burma, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia today. These territories had become vital sources of strategic supplies such as oil and rubber. Now the United States laid plans to roll back the Japanese gains. The aim was to cut the country's supply lines by seizing the occupied territories. Japan could then be gradually strangled to death. But to win in the vast expanse of the Pacific, the US would need to develop new forms of mobile warfare. They would be based on amphibious landings supported by aircraft flying from carriers. The Japanese, unable to match American firepower, resorted to increasingly desperate measures. The country fell back on ancient notions of military honor to create suicide units. The result would be a terrible loss of life. This would be a decisive phase in the war in the Pacific and would mark the end of Japan's dreams of empire. But this was to come. Back in the spring of 1943, the US military chiefs faced a dilemma. They had been presented with two options for the defeat of Japan. The flamboyant US Army General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the US and Australian forces in the Southwest Pacific, favored a primarily land-based route. His idea was to seize the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and the Philippines. They could then be turned into a strategic barrier that would cut off Japan from its newly conquered lands in Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Japan would be starved into surrender. Equally importantly, this plan would mean MacArthur could repay a debt. Earlier in the war, he had been kicked out of the Philippines by the Japanese, and he had promised to return to liberate the country. But the US Navy had a different idea. It would bypass the heavily defended Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and the Philippines. Instead, it would seize a string of much smaller islands scattered across the Central Pacific and close to the Japanese homeland. Rather than a barrier, the US would have a series of strategic bases from which to attack Japan's supply lines. They argued it would be swifter and much more economic. The American military command put off the decision. Both the Army and Navy were told to go ahead. In June 1943, MacArthur's plan was launched. It was called Operation Cartwheel. The first target was the major Japanese military base at Rabaul on New Britain in the Solomon Islands. It would be a two-pronged attack. The eastern prong fought its way up through New Georgia and Bougainville. The western prong battled its way through Papua New Guinea. But the virtually impenetrable jungle and unhealthy climate made progress slow. It was nearly 9 months before the pincers met, and the Japanese base at Rabaul was isolated. Meanwhile, as the US Army took control of the Solomon Islands, the US Navy mustered a mighty fleet. It included the first 4 of the brand new Essex-class aircraft carriers. They were bigger and faster than anything before. The new carriers were equipped with outstanding new planes like the Hellcat and Corsair fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers. Together, they both outperformed and outnumbered their Japanese opponents. The Navy's first targets were the Japanese garrisons on the coral atolls of Tarawa and Makin in the Gilbert Islands. These were close to some of the most important supply routes across the Pacific. For a week, the atolls were bombed by carrier-based aircraft. Then, on November the 20th, 1943, there was an amphibious landing. Makin was captured with little difficulty. But Tarawa was a different story. Reconnaissance had failed to reveal that the water was too shallow for the landing craft. As the Marines waded ashore, they came under intense fire. The island was honeycombed with fortified machine gun nests. US troops who made it to dry land were pinned down on the beach. By the end of the day, over 1,500 of the 5,000 US Marines landed had been killed or severely injured. Over the next 2 days, frontal assaults pushed the Japanese back inch by inch. Very often, only flamethrowers could eliminate the Japanese strongpoints. It took 3 days before the last pocket of Japanese resistance was wiped out. Of the 4,200 Japanese troops on the island, only 17 were captured alive. Tarawa was a terrible forerunner of what was to come. The Japanese had shown that there would be no question of surrender. They would fight to the death. It was a grim prospect. In January 1944, America's naval offensive in the Pacific moved on to the Marshall Islands. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the US naval commander in the Central Pacific, was anxious to avoid another bloodbath. So, aircraft from his carrier force bombed Japanese airfields on the islands for nearly 2 months. Finally, on February the 1st, 1944, he sent in the assault forces. The flat and open island of Roy was quickly overrun. But the islands of Kwajalein and Namur were wooded, and the Japanese resisted fanatically. US forces used flamethrowers and explosives. The Japanese responded by launching suicidal banzai charges. But the US forces now knew what to expect. The Japanese were beaten back. Atoll after atoll in the Marshall Islands now fell to the US advance. Kwajalein was followed by Atoll. The island of Truk was bypassed and cut off. Though a small Japanese garrison would remain undefeated until the end of the war. The way was now clear for the next push, 1,000 miles west towards the Mariana Islands. If captured, the islands would put the Japanese mainland within range of US heavy bombers. They would also enable America to block Japan's supply lines from Southeast Asia. On June the 11th, 1944, the US started to soften up the 3 main islands in the Marianas. Four days later, Marines stormed the beaches of the northerly island of Saipan. This time, the terrain was mountainous, with many caves, and the preliminary bombardment had not disrupted the Japanese defenses as much as had been hoped. Nevertheless, by the end of the day, the American bridgehead was secure. In Tokyo, the news caused mounting alarm. The Japanese High Command now sent a carrier fleet to rescue the situation and save the Marianas. But the task force was spotted by US submarines. The Americans sent their main carrier force to intercept the Japanese. On the morning of June the 19th, 1944, the Japanese launched airstrikes against the US ships. But US radar saw them coming. "450 fighters were scrambled to intercept the Japanese planes. It turned into the largest aircraft carrier battle ever fought. The US task force had 15 aircraft carriers and more than 900 aircraft. Ranged against it, the Japanese had 9 carriers and nearly 500 aircraft. But Japan had lost many of its experienced air crews during the Solomon and Marshall Islands campaigns. Its novice pilots faced battle-hardened US flyers. The Japanese were outgunned and outfought. It would go down in history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Half an hour into the battle, a torpedo from a US submarine hit the newest and largest Japanese carrier, the Taiho, while she was still launching aircraft. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had claimed its first major victim. At around the same time, another US submarine torpedoed the carrier Shokaku. She was completely destroyed. Nevertheless, the Japanese commander decided to continue with the operation, hoping to stop further US landings in the Marianas. For much of the following day, the US forces tried to pin down the exact location of the remaining Japanese carriers.
Bearing 096.
It took them until the afternoon to find them. It was late in the day to launch an attack, and the aircraft would have to fly at the limit of their range. But the US Task Force commander, Admiral Mark Mitcher, decided to gamble and attack. A third Japanese carrier, the Hayo, was hit and sunk. The Japanese had lost over 300 aircraft. But as the US planes now returned, dangerously short of fuel, they ran into a problem. In the gathering darkness, they couldn't find their own carriers. Many ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the sea. Mitcher, in an act of extraordinary courage, ordered his carriers to switch on their lights to guide in the returning aircraft. Fortunately for the Americans, there were no Japanese submarines to see them. Nevertheless, over 80 US planes were lost, either through having to ditch in the sea or through crashing while they landed. But Japanese losses had been even greater. 3 carriers and most of the aircraft needed to equip its remaining carrier fleet were gone. From now on, the United States Navy would dominate the Pacific, striking when and where it wanted.
The future is in the city.
We live in cities now as a species, and there's no going back.
Experts weigh in on one of the world's youngest global cities.
Singapore is now at a crossroads. It's at a real turning point.
A search for the hidden design and soul that makes a city livable.
This is a typical Singaporean breakfast.
Living Cities, Singapore, a 6-part series, premieres Wednesday, 15th of December, exclusive to Discovery Channel. Boom.
shouldn't be doing this without backup.
You are the backup.
Oh, yeah.
It's your cousin?
Use your next words carefully.
What kind of cops are you? The new kind.
Hawaii Five-0, only on AXN.
Take 3 men with drastically different survival skills. Throw in some hellacious terrain. Multiply it with Monday nights on Discovery. Add in one common goal.
Crazy.
Survival. Subtract the sum of all fears with Dual Survival at 9. Followed by Man vs. Wild at 10. Only on Discovery Channel. Discovery Channel dropped 7 volunteers into a condemned town.
Oh, God.
Alone.
Where am I?
They were told there was a biological disaster.
There is nothing we can do.
Told to rebuild.
We die together, we live together.
Told to restart.
I trust my fellow colonists with my life.
We all fought valiantly.
And we have fire.
The society fell apart. Would you? The Colony. Wednesday nights on Discovery Channel. The North Atlantic is ruthless. But beneath the waves is a prize many will die for.
It's a battle of one man and one fish.
Look out!
Sometimes the fish wins.
Discovery will put you right next to the men and women
He's on the verge of breaking if he hasn't already broke.
on the hunt
Fish on!
for giants.
Commercial fishing is the most dangerous job in the world.
Swords. A new season starts Monday, 20th of December on Discovery Channel.
The Japanese naval defeat in the Philippine Sea meant the United States could now press on with its assault on the Marianas. The Japanese forces on Saipan held out for 3 weeks before they were overcome on July the 9th, 1944. The last Japanese troops then launched their now inevitable suicide charge. Virtually the entire 32,000-strong garrison was killed. Over 3,000 Americans also died. Two weeks later, US Marines landed on the islands of Guam and Tinian, also in the Marianas. Once again, they faced suicidal Japanese counterattacks. But they failed to stop the American advance. The US Navy had seized the Marianas. Both the US Army and Navy offensives had now completed the first phase of their separate strategies to isolate Japan. The US military planners now had to make a choice. Should they continue to back MacArthur's strategy and move on to the capture of the Philippines? Or should they go with the naval plan and send a fleet across the Pacific to seize Taiwan or the Ryukyu Islands? The naval option would isolate Japan without the need for an almost certainly lengthy and bloody operation to take the Philippines. But at a meeting in Hawaii on July the 26th, 1944, MacArthur charmed President Roosevelt into backing his plan to liberate the Philippines. The Navy was instructed to support it before returning to its island-hopping strategy. It was a decision that would cost a horrendous number of both military and civilian lives. The following month, US forces landed on the Philippine island of Leyte. They took the Japanese by surprise. They had expected the first US landing to be on the main island of Luzon. Within hours, MacArthur was striding ashore with press photographers in attendance. He later made a broadcast to the Philippine people.
I see that the old flagstaff still stands. Have your troops hoist the colors to its peak, and let no enemy ever haul them down.
Programs that had you on the edge of your seats, that amazed you, thrilled you, and inspired you. Re-experience, relive the best of Discovery. Starts tonight on Discovery Channel. When disaster strikes.
Monster tornado! Oh my God!
When lives spiral into darkness.
She's in a reserve parachute and it's spinning.
When all is lost.
The roof just collapsed.
Felt like 100 earthquakes at one time.
Some overcome impossible odds to find themselves.
I think I'm stronger being through this.
When faced by extreme peril. Tomorrow night on Discovery Channel.
People, if they dare, then have me, all of me, in their homes. Even dressed like this. It's not aggressive, is it? They would get it afterwards. Obviously, you don't want me in your house. Bollywood, it's only big for one star, and that's me. Stay down! Stay down! Obviously, I've got to be invited.
Open your doors and invite Mr. Right, a new series. Premieres Tuesday, 14th of December on TLC.
New to view this December on Discovery Channel. Bear takes on life-threatening scenarios closer to home. Worst case scenario. Swordfishmen put their lives on the line to reel in the ultimate haul. A new season of Swords. Sustainable living amid dwindling resources. Powering the future. All new this December on Discovery Channel.
The Japanese soon recovered and launched an ambitious plan to use the remains of their naval power to counterattack. Operation Show, meaning victory, was typically complex. The main strength of the Japanese fleet was divided into two groups to form a pincer. One pincer would approach through the San Bernardino Straits and attack the US landing from the north. The second would come in through the Surigao Straits and attack from the south. Meanwhile, a decoy group of Japan's last 4 carriers would approach the Philippines from the northeast, hoping to lure away the main US carrier force covering the landing. The northern arm of the Japanese pincer came under air attack almost immediately. After nearly 2 days of bombardment, the super battleship Musashi was sunk. The northern pincer then appeared to retreat. It was now that the US commanders got into a muddle. The man in charge of the main carrier force covering the landings was Admiral William Bull Halsey. He now got word of the Japanese carriers approaching from the northeast. Halsey, believing the northern pincer was no longer a threat, set off to intercept them. He had fallen for the Japanese decoy. The force protecting the US landing was now severely weakened. But the commander of this force now inadvertently compounded the problem. Unaware that Halsey had taken off, he sent his battleships to ambush the southern arm of the Japanese pincer. It looked like a spectacular success. But then disaster struck. The northern arm of the Japanese pincer had only pretended to retreat. Under cover of darkness, it turned round and headed back. It then attacked the hugely depleted force protecting the US landing. Only a handful of small escort carriers and destroyers faced the Japanese super battleship Yamato and 3 other battleships. It was now the turn of the Americans to put up a desperate fight. The Japanese tactic had caught the US aircraft unprepared. They were armed with high explosives for land operations rather than armor-piercing bombs for ships. Then, just as it seemed the Japanese must break through, they suddenly turned tail. Their commander had worried he was sailing into a trap. Meanwhile, to the north, Halsey's headlong rush to intercept the Japanese decoy force finally paid off. On October the 25th, 1944, all 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had completely finished off Japan's once proud navy. There was now little hope of holding back the American advance. For Japan, it was time for desperate measures. The stage was set for a terrible climax to MacArthur's plan.
The future is in the city.
We live in cities now as a species, and there's no going back.
Experts weigh in on one of the world's youngest global cities.
Singapore is now at a crossroads. It's at a real turning point.
A search for the hidden design and soul that makes a city livable.
This is a typical Singaporean breakfast.
Living Cities, Singapore, a 6-part series. Premieres Wednesday, 15th of December, exclusive to Discovery Channel. In a split second, the unexpected could make you a victim or survivor. Would you know what to do?
Welcome to worst case scenario.
Bear Grylls has a new mission.
Stay really close to me.
Putting himself into the real-life scenarios you fear most. And finding the smartest ways.
Keep calm, just think through the situation.
To get out alive. Worst case scenario. Wednesday night on Discovery Channel.
Be awed this December. On Animal Planet, wildlife struggle to move with the relentless change of seasons. A year in the wild. Brush up your knowledge on all things feline. Cats 101. There is nowhere to hide when the threat comes from within. More real-life stories, monsters inside me. Be Horde this December on Animal Planet. Programs that had you on the edge of your seats. That amazed you. Thrilled you. And inspired you. Re-experience, relive the best of Discovery. Starts tonight on Discovery Channel.
By the autumn of 1944, the Allies had isolated the Japanese forces in the Philippines. Their naval support had been destroyed. Japan needed a new tactic if it was to hold back the American advance. The Japanese commander in the islands called for volunteers to join special units. They were called the kamikazes, or divine wind, and drew on the Japanese military code of honor that it was better to die than live as a coward. They were suicide units. On October the 25th, 1944, the first kamikaze unit took a final ceremonial drink before taking off. Its target was the US fleet. The escort carrier, St. Lo, was sunk, and 2 others badly damaged. Further kamikaze attacks followed. But MacArthur was undaunted. He now moved on to the main Philippine island of Luzon. The defenses were, as usual, softened up by air attacks. The US troops went ashore virtually unopposed. But as they advanced, Japanese resistance stiffened. By January the 23rd, 1945, they had reached the major air base of Clark Field, 60 miles from the capital, Manila. A week later, they were approaching the capital itself. There now began a ferocious month-long battle to seize the Philippine capital. The US troops fought their way into the city. By the end of February, the Japanese defenders had been driven back into the 16th century citadel of Intramuros. It would take another week of fierce fighting to flush them out. By spring 1945, US forces were closing in on Japan from the south and east. Japan had invaded China in 1937. The United States had regarded the Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, as a Western ally and sent aid. Much of it went in through British-controlled Burma along the so-called Burma Road over the mountains to southern China. Then, in 1942, Japan invaded Burma and kicked out the British. The Burma Road was shut down. Instead of sending in a conventional force, small groups of soldiers were infiltrated deep behind Japanese lines. They were known as Chindits and were the brainchild of an unconventional officer called Ord Wingate. Their task was to destroy railway lines and disrupt Japanese communications.
Chindits, that's the name for the guardian statues which stand at the steps of Burmese pagodas. A name from legend that's become flesh and blood, living guardians of Burma's liberty.
But the Japanese soon began to hunt them down. By mid-April 1943, over 1/3 of the Chindit forces had been killed. The remainder were forced back into India. The struggle to retake Burma was becoming a serious problem. So, in late 1943, the Allies turned to US General Joseph Stilwell.
We got run out of Burma, and it's humiliating as hell. I think we ought to find out what caused it, go back and retake the place.
Stilwell had spent years helping to overhaul the forces of neighboring China. The Allies now decided to put them to the test. Stilwell's Chinese soldiers, reinforced by an elite US group of jungle fighters known as Merrill's Marauders, would be sent into Burma. In October 1943, they crossed the border and made their way down the east side of the country. Meanwhile, the British India Army launched a diversionary strike along the Burmese coast. Finally, Chindits moved into northern Burma, deep behind enemy lines, to cut Japanese supply routes. The Japanese fell for the diversionary tactic and sent forces to counterattack along the coast. 2 divisions of troops from British India came under fierce fire. But the Allied forces stood their ground. They were resupplied from the air. They could now fight back, and 2 weeks later, the Japanese withdrew. But it was only a temporary reprieve. The Japanese launched a counter-offensive of their own. In March 1944, they invaded India in an attempt to disrupt Allied preparations for further attacks. For 2 weeks, there was intense fighting. But there was stiff resistance, and the Japanese were finally forced to withdraw. Over 65,000 of them were killed. It was a major blow to their military strength in the region. Meanwhile, in Burma, Stilwell's Chinese forces had fought their way down the east side of the country, and by May 1944 had reached the important crossroads town of Myitkyina on the old Burma Road. For 3 months, the Japanese held them off. But in early August 1944, Myitkyina was overrun. The way was now clear for Stilwell's men to push further on down the east side of the country. They were soon joined by a fresh force of Anglo-Indian troops under British General William Slim. This began advancing into the center of the country. In early March 1945, Slim's forces took the important communications center of Mektila. Soon afterwards, they seized Mandalay. With the monsoon season now approaching, Stilwell's forces dug in on the east. But Slim's forces pushed on towards the Burmese capital of Rangoon. They were slowed down by the rain. But by early May 1945, the Allied troops were 20 miles north of Rangoon. Allied reinforcements were now sent in from the south to support them. Gurkhas parachuted into the Irrawaddy Delta. An Indian division came in by sea. On May the 3rd, 1945, the Allied forces finally entered Rangoon. But the city was empty. The Japanese had pulled out rather than risk being cut off. The monsoon was now in full flow. But the campaign to clear the Japanese out of Burma was effectively over. The next stop in the war in Southeast Asia would be Malaya. But for all the success, Allied losses in the war against the Japanese had been terrible. The Americans were desperate to find a way to bring the war to an end without having to invade the Japanese homeland.
The future is in the city.
We live in cities now as a species, and there's no going back.
Experts weigh in on one of the world's youngest global cities.
Singapore is now at a crossroads. It's at a real turning point.
A search for the hidden design and soul that makes a city livable.
This is a typical Singaporean breakfast.
Living Cities, Singapore, a 6-part series. Premieres Wednesday, 15th of December, exclusive to Discovery Channel. Two of Bear's most die-hard fans join him for a taste of survival at its most extreme.
Pure evil. Yeah, it's pure evil.
Man vs. Wild. Tonight on Discovery Channel. Help! When disaster strikes.
Monster tornado! Oh my God!
When When lives spiral into darkness.
She's under reserve parachute and it's spinning.
When all is lost.
The roof just collapsed.
Felt like 100 earthquakes at one time.
Some overcome impossible odds to find themselves.
I think I'm stronger being through this.
When faced by extreme peril. Tomorrow night.